I expected Alabaster Dawn to feel like an early access slice, promising, clearly unfinished, and probably something I could play for a few hours before setting aside until the full release. Instead, even though the Steam page says the current build has around 6 to 10 hours of content, I ended up spending closer to 20. That came from me taking my time with it, exploring, doing side quests, working through dungeons and puzzle areas, and trying to see what this version of the game actually offers. So your playtime may be very different from mine. Just a quick reminder, this is not a final review. Alabaster Dawn is still in early access, the story is still being expanded, some systems need more room, and Radical Fish is still building towards 1.0. But the foundation is already working. That is the main thing I came away with. Alabaster Dawn is enjoyable right now because the core of the game feels good. The movement is responsive, the combat keeps you involved, the puzzles are approachable without feeling empty, and the exploration has that old school adventure structure where each new tool, path, and dungeon makes the world feel a little more open than it did before. The story has not fully grabbed me yet, but playing the game did. Alabaster Dawn is a 2.5D pixel art action RPG from Radical Fish Games, the studio behind CrossCode. You play as Juno, an outcast chosen who wakes in the ruined world of Tyrann Sol after Nyx has destroyed civilization and left humanity lost or asleep. That is the basic setup, and I will be coming back to the story later on in the video. For now, the important thing is how the game feels in your hands. This is not a traditional open world sandbox. There are large areas, optional paths, caves, hidden treasures, side quests, and places to explore, but the structure reminds me more of an old school Zelda-style adventure than a massive open world. The game is built around interconnected spaces that gradually make more sense as you gain the right tools. A barrier that seemed fixed before can become a path forward later, a switch you cannot use yet starts to matter once a new element enters the picture, a side route that looked decorative can become a hidden reward once you understand how the area is built. That structure works because controlling Juno feels good from the beginning. Running, jumping, attacking, switching tools, and moving through the world all feel responsive. In a game built around action and puzzles, that responsiveness is the piece everything else depends on. Alabaster Dawn avoids the problem that can sink this kind of game before the systems even matter. The combat is probably the strongest part of the current build. Not because it is especially punishing. Right now, I would not call this a difficult game. I only died a couple of times, mostly from being caught off guard by boss attacks, and dying did not seem especially punishing. But the combat still asks you to pay attention. You cannot stand still, mash attack, and expect everything to fall apart in front of you. Even weaker enemies can pressure you if you let them surround you. You need to dodge, parry, recognize attack patterns, and know when to back away. That is what I liked about it. The game is not trying to crush you, it is asking you to stay awake. Your dodge can become a perfect dodge if timed correctly, and your guard can function as a parry if you time it properly. Enemy attacks are readable enough that you can respond, and hits have enough impact to make combat feel satisfying without becoming slow. Some encounters happen naturally as you move through the field, while the more serious fights lock you into an arena until everything is defeated. That gives those encounters more weight without making the game especially hard. The weapon system builds on that by giving your tools practical uses beyond damage. Early on, I unlocked a sword, a crossbow, and a hammer. The sword gives you slashing damage, which makes it the better option against certain enemy types, while the hammer covers blunt damage and works better against armored enemies. The crossbow matters because some enemies sit outside melee range, perched on cliffs, or positioned where you need a ranged answer. The hammer also breaks rock barriers that block access to certain areas. So weapon switching has a practical purpose. You're not just choosing between different flavors of damage. You are reading the situation and choosing the tool that fits it. That idea becomes stronger when the elemental system starts to open up. You begin with wind, then later unlock lightning, which the game calls ether. Each element works almost like its own stance because you can slot 2 weapons into each element at a time. So you are not just choosing which weapon to use, you are also deciding how that weapon fits into that specific elemental loadout. That shows up in combat and puzzle solving. Enemy weaknesses, switches, and dungeon obstacles can all ask you to think about the element you are using. And each element can also be equipped with a divine art, which functions like a powerful element-specific spell for bursting down enemies or controlling groups. That is where the systems start to connect. Weapons are not separate from elements, elements are not separate from puzzles, combat and dungeon design start to feed into each other. The later ranged weapons push this further. By the end of the current build, I had unlocked 2 melee weapons and 3 ranged weapons, and the ranged weapons especially start to matter outside of combat. The chakram becomes a key puzzle tool because it lets you grab spherical objects and move or throw them from one place to another, even when Juno does not have direct line of sight to the destination. Later on, the kusarigama lets you pull yourself towards specific poles across certain gaps. That is the kind of design I like. These weapons are not just damage types, they change how you read the room, solve a puzzle, and move through the world. The bosses and puzzles both support that same foundation. The first major boss I fought was a giant wasp, and for an early boss, it made a good first impression. Later bosses had their own identity too, including a turtle-like enemy and another with a tentacle-style attack. The fights I played were mostly about reading the boss, avoiding larger attacks, dealing damage when an opening appeared, and eventually staggering the boss so you could punish it more aggressively. I'm not ready to call the boss design a major strength across the full game yet, but based on what is here, the bosses are fun and well matched to the kind of action RPG Alabaster Dawn is trying to be. The puzzles worked for me too. Most of the ones I encountered use range attacks, elemental interactions, or companion abilities to move objects, activate switches, or route something through the room. They are not overly difficult, but they are not empty either. I had to think about what I was doing without feeling like the puzzle were stopping the adventure in its tracks. The question is whether the full game keeps expanding those mechanics over time, because several puzzles are built around similar ideas right now. Progression is where you can feel the edge of the current build most clearly. Juno has a main skill tree for core improvements like strength, health, stamina, and guard or parry effectiveness. Weapons also level up separately, giving you points for each weapon's own skill tree. I like that setup because it gives each weapon a sense of growth. But in the current build, I already maxed out several weapon skill trees while still earning experience for those weapons. At that point, I have points coming in with nothing left to spend them on. For early access, that is not a serious problem, but you can feel the ceiling. The developers have said they plan to expand the weapon skill trees in the future updates, so this seems like something they are aware of. Still, in the build that exists right now, it is one of the clearer reminders that this is not the finished version of the game. The other supporting systems add texture without taking over. Gems work like stat modifiers that can be equipped on Juno or her weapons, while cooking lets you use ingredients found in the world to make food that gives you useful benefits before heading out. There is also an optional roguelike mode called Somu's Dream, which takes place inside the dream of an NPC who has lost his memories. It has its own progression, its own currency, an enhanced version of bosses you have already encountered in the story. I think Somu's Dream is a good addition, especially if it stays optional. Not everyone is going to want a roguelike mode inside their action RPG, and I would not want it to become mandatory. But for players who enjoy repeatable combat challenges, it adds longevity after you have reached the edge of the current story content. All of that is why Alabaster Dawn does not feel like a brief sample. It feels like the beginning of a much larger game. The world itself is where I started to feel more of its pull. The story begins with Juno waking in Terran's soul after Nyx has already left the world in ruins. Humanity is either lost or asleep, the gods have gone silent, and Juno is left trying to break the curse, awaken people, rebuild settlements, and understand what has happened to the world around her. The premise is clear, but the story itself has not fully landed for me yet. At this point, it still feels like the game is introducing the world, the characters, and the central mystery. The gods appear in some way, but there are still major questions about what is happening with them and what Nyx really is. So right now, the story is not the main reason I'm interested. The stronger part is the way the world changes around the story. In the sections I played, the restoration loop becomes one of the more interesting parts of the game. You push through land corrupted by Nyx until you reach the source of that corruption. And once it is destroyed, the area begins to change. The dead, alien quality of the place gives way to plant life again. Vaults open, People who had been asleep return to the world, and the settlements slowly start to feel less like a ruin and more like a place trying to exist again. That gives the adventure a sense of purpose. You're not only clearing corruption to move the objective forward, you are watching the world recover in small, visible ways. And for me, that is where the atmosphere worked best. Sunderland was the best example of that so far. I enjoyed reaching the second city more than the first settlement because it felt more involved. There were more puzzles, stronger enemies, and a larger sense of place. Sunderland is still ruined, but it already feels more ambitious than the first village. Because the game is built around restoration, there's a natural curiosity there. You want to see what it becomes. That is the part of Alabaster Dawn's world that I find most promising. The idea that these places can return from ruin and that your journey is tied to that recovery. The characters are still developing, but there are pieces I like. Early on, you unlock Filia, a companion the game calls a wise, and she became one of my favorite characters so far. Filia is not really there to be a damage dealer, at least from what I played. Her value comes from how important she is to shredding enemy mechanics and puzzle solutions. Some situations specifically require a wise, so even if she is not carrying fights through raw damage, she is still essential. I also found her charming, maybe more immediately charming than Juno at this stage. Juno herself is more reserved, she is timid, and she does not see herself as worthy of being called a hero. Part of that comes from being an outcast and not originally being one of the chosen before Nyx arrived. And from the flashbacks, it seems like this is not new for her. Even before Nyx, Juno was already shy, uncertain, and afraid of stepping into the role people expected from her. Right now, I am treating that as a setup. Her uncertainty may become the foundation for real character growth later on in the campaign. But because the story is still early, I would not judge the arc too strongly yet. The presentation supports the game more than it tries to overwhelm you. The 2.5D pixel art is detailed and animated in a way that feels closer to modern high-end pixel art than simple retro nostalgia. More importantly, it usually stays readable, which matters in a game built around height, climbing ledges, gaps, and hidden paths. Every now and then, I did misjudge the height of something, but overall the style works well with the level design. There's not a massive amount of environmental variety in this current build, but what is here works. Grassy fields, rocky paths, caves, temple-like interiors, and corrupted Nyx zones give the early access version enough visual range, and small touches like rain help the world feel a little more alive. The main presentation caveat is that there is no voice acting. For me, that is not a major problem, but it is worth knowing because if you do not like reading dialogue, that may affect how much you connect with the story and characters. For anyone interested in trying out Alabaster Dawn, there are a few practical things worth knowing. A demo is available, and progress from that demo can carry over into the full game. At the time I played, the game was listed at $24.99 USD, and the developers have indicated that the price may increase later on as more content is added. Radical Fish has also shared an early access roadmap with 8 major updates planned before version 1.0. The next major update is currently aiming for August with a new swamp region, another weapon, another elemental aspect, more quests, expanded weapon skill trees, and more floors for Somu's dream. That roadmap could change, but it gives a useful sense of where the game is heading. And that is where Alabaster Dawn stands for me right now. Not finished, not ready for a final verdict, but already enjoyable. The combat is responsive, the puzzles are entertaining, the exploration has a clear identity, and the world restoration loop gives the adventure a stronger sense of purpose. There are still real caveats. The story needs time to grow, the weapon progression needs more room, the puzzle design needs to keep evolving, and anyone jumping in now should understand that this is not the complete version of the game. But I enjoyed what was here. I kept playing longer than I expected. And when I reached the end of the current build, I was not relieved to be done. I was thinking less about the limits of early access and more about what might come next. Another area, another weapon, another dungeon, another city waiting to be restored. That is the strongest thing I can say about Alabaster Dawn right now. It does not show me that the full game will deliver on everything, but it does show me that the core works. If you enjoy action RPGs with an old-school Zelda-like structure, responsive combat, environmental puzzles, large interconnected zones, and games that slowly build their world through exploration and restoration, Alabaster Dawn is worth keeping an eye on. I'm not saying everyone needs to buy it in early access, but I'm glad that I did. And whenever version 1.0 arrives, I want to see where this world goes next. If you guys enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, please drop a like and subscribe to the channel. It will really help me out. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.